what I'm going to be talking about now is really a talk developed and given many times by Michael Mautner. He is, among other things, L5 member number 48, a great distinction, which at least some of the people here will appreciate. And he currently lives in New Zealand. He's a chemist. He got to thinking some time ago about the question of, well, if you can make solar power satellites, one of the reasons you might make them is because the greenhouse effect has kind of gotten out of hand. You decide you like electric power, but you can't burn coal or oil for it anymore. You don't like nuclear energy. So you're going to make solar power satellites. Now, maybe we would be so clever as to figure out this is going to happen before we're really in trouble. Build solar power satellites, make the transition from coal and oil to them. Everything would be peachy keen. The world not being this kind of perfect place will probably go along until long after the point where it's really obvious we're in trouble. And then make the transition to solar power satellites after things are kind of messed up. Now, should this happen, if you look at what it would take to build a solar power satellite, this is really not an amount of effort that's small compared to the amount of effort of doing things like controlling the amount of sunlight that falls on Earth, controlling the environment, controlling the climate, correcting past errors. So I'll talk about some ways to do that, but first note the most important thing that Michael says, which is even though we can make believable arguments that it's technically feasible to correct climatic excursions after we've caused them, the smart thing to do is don't cause them in the first place. Don't have to develop this technology. Do something like solar power satellites relatively early, while there's still options. However, the world being the place it is, this may not be a choice. So, if you talk about the solar power satellite scenario, don't worry about how we get there. Don't worry about whether it's a centrally planned government program of the kind we all know and love so dearly. Don't worry about whether private enterprise somehow makes it happen. Don't worry about whether it's evolutionary or revolutionary. Just worry about what does it take to make a solar power satellite. Typically, it takes tens of thousands of tons of fairly highly processed material, very special things like solar cells, very special controlled electronics, very precise large structures. These kinds of things, replicated several hundred times, could provide all of the energy needed on Earth. Well, if instead of converting the sunlight to energy and delivering it very selectively to Earth, you simply wish to divert some of it, you only basically need some small pieces of tinfoil and a little bit of control circuitry to make sure it stays where you want it. Perhaps you don't even need tinfoil. One of the simplest things you could imagine doing is if, say, you had a lunar factory making solar power satellite parts, or if, say, you had hauled an asteroid to a convenient location to make solar power satellite parts, you could certainly take all of the dross and crud, crunch it up into very fine powder, and shoot it off into space in such a direction that it wouldn't end up in Earth orbit and annihilate all the satellites, which I think I saw a face referring to, but would go into a heliocentric orbit or a high Earth orbit where it would be relatively stable. It would not cross the Earth's orbit. It would not tend to interact with your spacecraft. It would tend to cut down the solar flux at Earth's surface by 2 or 3%. 2 or 3% corresponds to a global warming of 1 or 2%. This is a very brute force approach. Assumes that the Earth has a very nice linear isotropic response to forcing functions. Probably, it's a good first approximation, but probably you would do that in some places would be hotter than you wanted and some would be cooler than you wanted, even worse than today. So you could imagine, once you've done something like that, or instead of doing something like that, perhaps you would rather use something a little more clever. Perhaps you would rather not just put a neutral density filter between the Earth and the Sun. Perhaps you would like to put some solar sails between the Earth and the Sun. If you put them in a levitated orbit near the L1 point, so they're far from the Earth, your spacecraft can't hit them, they don't cast big shadows, they cast a diffuse shadow across the Earth. That will be convenient if you had about 10,000 of them that were 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. They were a mil thick. They would weigh about as much as a solar power satellite. They would also be a much simpler thing than a solar power satellite. No highly processed silicon, no fancy stiff aluminum beams, basically aluminum foil, some not trivial control mechanism, but no worse than the one that's needed to keep the solar power satellite from flopping around. And you could block out a desired fraction of the sunlight from the Earth surface. You can block it out in different ratios during the year. You can have a different ratio of blockage corresponding to the different latitudes on the Earth's surface. And you could be doing all of this with a system that's redundant, 10,000-fold redundant. You need a fairly high failure rate before you start to see a difference. It's far away from the Earth, so that even if these things fail in particularly creative ways, them being solar sails, perhaps they'll simply start accelerating as fast as they can. They're unlikely to have any problems with them hitting Earth. You're unlikely to have any problems with them hitting spacecraft. You could also imagine somewhat more clever things to do with selectively reflective solar sail, or perhaps with transmissive dust, or selectively reflective dust, or perhaps with 1 mil transmissive glass, so that let's say that you not only goofed on the greenhouse effect, but you kind of don't have much of an ozone layer anymore. This is something that appears to be quite possible. In 10 or 20 years, we'll know how well we're doing in controlling that. Of course, once we know, it'll take a couple of hundred years of patience before it gets back to its natural state, so we might want to do something to cut down on the solar ultraviolet. Typical glasses that you can make once you take iron oxide out of the soils stop just the part of the UV spectrum that's damaging to the biosphere. So there are a lot of options here. I've kind of simplified and skipped over a lot of them in order to get through this quickly and entertain questions from the audience. But this is an exciting new concept. It's been briefly mentioned in the literature before. Michael Nautner thought it up. He's written some papers. He wrote a recent one with Kelly Parks, ex of American Rocket Company. It was presented at the Space 90 conference, where civil engineers talk about large space structures, so they kind of thought this is very interesting. And there's a lot of interesting work to do. There's many more questions than answers right now. One of the big questions, of course, is, well, the Earth's climate is a very complicated system. How does it respond to a different forcing function than the one that the sun gives it right now? What does the weather look like here if you shade out 3% of the energy? Does it look like it is when 2 degrees cooler? Or does it become an even bigger desert? Or do all of a sudden we get a rainforest in Los Angeles? Very good questions that one does need a practical answer for before going and doing these kinds of things and doing the experiment with our one test case, the Earth. However, very exciting concepts because they indicate not only that there's a robust set of choices for getting out of problems like global warming, but a robust set of choices for correcting them that all come from very similar technology in space. With that, I would like to entertain some questions for 10 minutes or so, then talk a little bit about what Peter Glazer had to say, and then let John Strickland give his presentation. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes, Tom Billings from Portland, Oregon. With this type of program being pushed, obviously it has some relationship to the mission to planet Earth that is being talked about a good bit, of course.
Yes.
If that is made a major part of what we want to do in space, and if, for instance, either NSS or many of the other space advocacy organizations start pushing that, do you believe that we will be able to actually win over large portions of the environmental groups so that we would not have some of the difficulties such as at the Galileo launch and so on?
Having worked with them extensively, it's clear to me that those making various comments in our housework and have not. There are 2 really key things to realize. Everyone in this room is in this room because they have a certain commonality in how their brain works. When they were 2 or 3 or whatever, their mother treated them a certain way. They kind of decided to have a certain approach to the world that seemed to fit in. This commonality that you and I share, we do not in general share with people in the environmental movement. They're in that movement because they have a very different thing going for all of them as a group. When we talk to them, we tend to miss the big point. The big point being not that they have good technical reasons to criticize how the environment is being damaged, but that they simply observe that there's a problem and observe that a lot of people that are doing technology have indeed lied to them in the past, which is a fact we cannot escape. And then they think, in a way that you or I wouldn't, but which makes perfect sense to them. Technology, people lie, the environment's messed up. Technology is bad, it messes up the environment. Now, this is a very basic thing for all of these people. You're not going to tell them that technology is good because it fixes the environment. This doesn't compute. It's not a choice. You can certainly work with them so as not to be confrontational, but you can't be highly involved with them and talk about this kind of thing and have anything but confrontation. You have to work with them in a way of making sure that they consider what you're doing very neutral and they're not highly involved, because then they won't consider it a threat. You have to be very honest about all of the problems, which is never done in aerospace. First thing you have to admit is mission to planet Earth is far from a perfect program, and NASA's far from a perfect agency. And maybe we won't do such a good job, but we have to try because it is important. We don't know how else to look at this except with technology. If you do that, you can keep from being at cross purposes, but you can never work together with these people. Because what you're looking at, what motivates you, is intrinsically different from what you're looking at, what motivates them. Yes?
Could I say something about what you just mentioned? I've been working with, actually for the last 10 years, I have been active in an environmental group in Austin. And I've been observing what the group you're talking about for over 15 years, like Amory Lovins and the Rifkins and that sort of group. And it seems pretty clear there are two types of environmental persons. There's a pragmatic environmentalist, that one who's actually interested in protecting the environment in a rational way.
The 1%.
The 1%.
Like we're the 1% of the people that want to go to space.
And then there is the ideological environmentalist. A lot of the problem with that group is on hang-ups relating to energy use, and especially the question of the extra energy coming down from space, and of course all the technological issues you just mentioned. And I think it's fairly clear now after the spring series of presentations that we gave at Earth Day, and also at that peace dividend meeting in Austin, that there seems to be a change among the grassroots environmentalists, where there are new generation of people coming up who are new to the environmental movement, who have not been, you might say, infected with the memes that have been promulgated by the Rifkins and similar groups. I think there's a very good chance by working with these groups now and looking at them as very possibly also being rational people, that we can win them over. You probably cannot win over the people who were environmentalists, say 10 or 15 years ago. I think there's a very good chance of winning over someone who started being an environmentalist like 5 years ago.
Point well taken. Yes, sir?
I'd also like to confirm what he's just stated also, because as it is, for those of you who listened to what was going on during the so-called Galileo incident that was taking place at the Cape, you'll also notice that while Jeremy Rifkin had his group, Christic Institute was there, and a number of others, a lot of other environmental groups were not there.
Right.
One in particular was Greenpeace. It was not there. One of the reasons why is, and I'm not exactly going out and toot my own horn on this, but I think it's about time somebody start coming up with it, because I've done it, you did, and just started it. I'm one of the 7 founding members of the International Greenpeace Foundation, along with I was one of the ones that ended up going out there chasing after whales and getting myself stuck in the middle between the harpoons and so-called whales out there, sitting out there in a goofy rubber dinghy. But I was in the space movement a long time before that, and Jim Cormack knew this. And one thing is that Jim had told me specifically, he said after we ended up splitting off from the Oceanic Society, which was the idea, that basically the name of the game is to be environmentally active, trying to clean up the environment, but the idea is to educate the people about the environment. But he also knew my background in the space program and what I believed in as well, and he said we can both work together if we can educate each other as to what each other stands for. The name of the game is not to go against each other, the name of the game is to work with each other, because we both can benefit from both ends.
If you
Very
don't,
much so. This lady, then that one back there.
I have been in environmental stuff since I was a little tiny kid, which goes back for a number of years at Mayo here. I'm also a hardcore space fan, and like he said, we can put them together, we have to put them together. And the key is mutual education. Environmentalists are not another species, like you seem to be speaking about this earlier. We're all in this together.
Well, we're not another species, we're just all clever and learn different ways to think. And I was addressing more the space advocates' tendency to address everyone, and so the arguments that he found compelling would compel everyone to see it his way, which doesn't work in space activism any more than it does in politics or everyday life. Everyone has their own view. You have to find out what they want to see, tell them that. Yes, ma'am?
If you keep these two groups segregated the way that you're suggesting, then the corporations are going to end up killing the Earth and using landfill on the moon. I mean, you got to be working together. Every one of the people in this room, I don't care if you want to go to space, I don't care if you want to go to Mars, the moon, I don't care where you want to go. You still have to live on the planet, and you still have to worry about the planet. And I don't understand why you're separating these groups and making enemies. I mean, I can't even believe this issue arose in this room. I don't think
If I may.
Not, well, I'll let
He's
you.
talking about fanatics on both
You are
sides.
correct, madam. You are correct, madam. The key that Andy was talking about, for those of us who have a 25 or 30-year history of shouting stuff for space, is that it didn't arise in the room, and there was a substantial period of time when I found a figure, for instance, in the early 70s, looking very much like myself, being burned in effigy on a college campus I was at because I was a space advocate by people at Earth Day. That is the problem with the history of the thing. It is correct that that history has got to be buried, first exhumed, gotten rid of, and then buried and gotten behind us. That type of thing, Andy is saying, even though it's got to be done, is not going to be as easy a process as I would love to see it be. And one of the things that is good here is that we've got a specific thing that can now show that space technology really can work positively and directly for the environment.
And a lot of my cautions, please don't oversell it. Probably can, but we can't tell you exactly how to do it right now. The people will be trusting as long as you don't claim you can, and they find out later that that was a little white lie. Let's try this, gentleman.
I think it's almost a truism to say that the intellectual insights of one generation become the commonplace, politics and economics commonplace of the next. Now, what's happened for the last 20 years, as far as I can see, is that we've been stuck in a sort of time warp. Somehow or other we got stuck in about 1968, and the thing has just run on, and quite suddenly, in the last few years, we've broken out of that. Now, we are 20 years further down the line. Environmentalism has come up again, but we've had 20 years to think about it. And the people who have been trying to work on space and other aspects of the environmental problem, from the technological side as well as the soft side, have now including space. And it is now the time for action. And frankly, I think the report was done, I can't quote it, but about 1970 on, was done in 1970 as to the world situation, population, and so on and so forth then. And the man who came out and said, well, what sort of technology do you want? Soft, hard, nuclear, what have you? He said, frankly, we want the lot yesterday.
Sounds a lot like the Club of Rome report, for those of you who read it. We're basically still on track. The solution is not to all sit here and starve as slowly as we can, but to increase the size of the pie. Yes, sir?
I'd like to ask this question of the group as a whole. We've talked with a number of people here. We've heard from a number of people who seem to be members of environmental groups. Obviously, by the presence here, they're indicating their pro space. Do we have a show of hands of how many people in the room are actively engaged in environmental groups?
Which is why we came to this session.
Suzanne?
I guess what our biggest problem is that just working, being a member of the Sierra Club and trying to get the local chapter to interface with the Sierra Club. And the Sierra Club has a very, a cause that's tangible. You can see it, you know, you can see the trees being destroyed, you can see these things. But what we're trying to sell is more theories, and it's a lot harder. And so them being used to having seen all this environmental thing, what we're trying to sell, even what Andy's got in mind, it's a lot more difficult because you have to, so you've got to find some tangible way, break the program down, that they can see it, and I think they grasp it. So it's just another way of looking at it rather than.
They have 500,000 members because they're selling something immediate, tangible, and personal, and we have 1/20th of that because we're selling something far truer, intangible, and impersonal. it's not surprising that people don't buy that as often. If, let me paraphrase you now. Gentleman in the back.
John Larry from Texas. I'm not an active environmentalist, but I do share a lot of the ideals that most of the people in this room do. And I am also a space advocate. And I have a question about the mainline environmental movement, Sierra Club, Audubon Society, things like that. I've heard recently that they do now oppose and have joined the Christic Institute and those other fringe movements, as I call them, in the RTG controversy. Is that a fact? Does anybody know about that?
It's a fact.
Do you think
it's very predictable, since their response is going to be plutonium. This is this bad, evil thing associated with all these guys that lied about how safe and cheap and wonderful nuclear energy would be for 30 years.
Does the Sierra Club have an active grassroots movement that we can appeal to bubble it up to the top of Sierra Club, so that, like what happened with Greenpeace, we can have an impact on the Sierra Club's involvement in the RTG issue? They should not be concerned, that's my opinion.
Well, yes, they do. They tend to make their decisions at the grassroots level because, like all of the big organizations, they're a bureaucracy. They have a very, very nice, very pretty building in San Francisco where their board of directors and officers meet every once in a while, jaw at each other, go away, and the grassroots chapters keep doing what they've been doing all along. It's very similar to NSS. You can appeal to the grassroots. I would be very interested in seeing whether or not you get tarred and feathered with that message.
Is it that strongly felt in the grassroots?
Yeah, because the grassroots, they tend not, you will find occasional people that really understand the technology and the questions and the issues, but most of the people are basic regular people, and their response is, well, the nuclear industry uses plutonium and they lied a lot for a long time. Plutonium must be bad and evil.
I'd be interested after this session to meet with someone who's really up on the negative side of the RTG issue, because I'm pro RTG in that respect, but I have been chartered in my local NSS chapter to take the RTG as a problem side of a debate that we're going to produce at one of the universities in my area. So if anybody knows a lot about the anti-RTG, I'd be happy to meet with them after that.
You might try finding Tim Kiger, who's at the conference somewhere. He actually argued on TV about pro versus the Christic Institute people when NSS headquarters wouldn't do it. I believe we had, well, we'll get you.
My name is Albert Schaefer, I'm San Diego L5. I'm an environmentalist, actively in that working percentage of my own time towards helping solve some of the problems with the ozone depletion, based on professional knowledge that I have in the field that I work. And one of the attitudes that I come across, which is a little bit frustrating and something that I have to face head on, is one that people who have been abusing the environment over a long period of time don't realize they're abusing the environment. People in the Sierra Club will have an attitude of, before we go out into space, I think it's important to take care of our own planet. In the meantime, they have no understanding that what they put down, when they're trying to figure out what to put down their garbage disposal, they're now realizing all they're doing is making a choice between sending it out to the San Diego Bay or sending it out to a San Diego landfill. And it's like, once it goes out of the house, I don't have to deal with it anymore, and I'm not polluting. And with the people with the problem with Freon being released into the atmosphere, I work with people who on a daily, regular basis take Freon R22 and just discharge it right out in the open atmosphere, just to freeze a pipe, so that they can very quickly and efficiently do finish a job. For years, the industry has been telling them this is a safe thing to do, and now we have to run around saying, hey, this isn't safe anymore. And they say, well, we've been doing it for 20 years. I haven't seen it hurt anybody. It hasn't hurt me at all. And so this is a real problem, reshaping a lot of these attitudes that are widespread, and coming up with something tangible to demonstrate to them, this is why we need to change our behavior. This is now, you need to stop throwing stuff down our disposals, or you can't even at all.
Do we have any more questions? Have I been missing anyone who doesn't wave their hand in the air frantically now? Back there, sir.
environmentalist and pro-space. The question is, why do we have to talk about the environmentalist opponents? The reason is that some of us who are pro-technology are not fully aware that some environmentalists will oppose us. They are politically effective. They're more numerous than we are. We have to be aware of this in all of our plans. That's why we have to discuss the environmentalist opposition. Thank you.
Sure.
I got here late, but it's kind of like a little synopsis of what's happened.
Okay, a synopsis of what's happened for those who got here. Michael Moutner from New Zealand, even though he's closer than that, he's in the Washington area right now, can't quite be here, so I'm able to talk for him. He has developed this concept of environmental remediation from space, in which he points out a very simple fact that's been overlooked for quite a while, which is that the engineering necessary to correct climatic ills that we may cause through our foolishness now and in the future is really much simpler than the technology necessary to do things like eliminate them by building solar power satellites. So assuming that we act as humanity has in the past and really kind of goof on maybe ozone and greenhouse effect, and at that point realize maybe we better build SPSs, we will be using a technology that can fairly easily correct these problems as well as preventing them from getting worse. And discuss some of the simpler ways you might do this, putting a fair amount of dust into heliocentric orbit so it's not near Earth and not wiping out your spacecraft, but shading just enough sunlight to cool the Earth down a couple of degrees. Or you could have levitated solar sails near the L1 point that would selectively shade the Earth just the way you want. You could have selectively reflective ones or selectively transmissive ones so that you could take out the UV in case you kind of make a bigger boo-boo with the ozone layer than we think we have. Find that out in 20 years, it would be nice to do something other than wait another century for it to get better. And then open to discussion from the audience about whatever related issues they cared to talk about, quite a bit of which was what we do and don't have in common with the environmental movement, how we could work together, and how in very basic ways we are for the same thing, that we may not realize it at the time. Yes, sir.
Perhaps I can clarify this environmental debate we've been having a bit. I had an occasion to publish an article to about 3,000 readers who were neutral on both space and the environment. It was not targeted to that audience. And the responses I got back from people who were concerned about the environment, I would say I could divide it into two categories. There were people that I would classify as Luddites or anti-technology, and since the root word of technology is knowledge, they're anti-knowledge. They want to go back to the Stone Age lifestyle, basically. They call themselves environmentalists because that's a popular thing to be today. But then there are also environmentalists who say we need an environment to survive so that we can survive. And they respond very positively toward space proposals. So with our tendency to label everything, we can't just label all environmentalists in one category and then decide whether they're good guys or bad guys. There's all sorts of subspecies, I guess, of environmentalists.
You're not supposed to just say everybody that's funny looking is bad, right? I thought that was the way it worked. It made life so simple. Where did you publish this article?
In a relatively small journal.
I believe I saw a hand over here, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment on the sort of the synopsis of where I came to relate also. The Earth's climate over the last million years has oscillated from a glacial to an interglacial cycle on like 120,000, 150,000 year cycle. And we're currently in what's considered an interglacial period where, had mankind not interfered with the input of carbon dioxide, methane, and other atmospheric gases, we should actually begin to go into a cooling phase based on the last million years of cycle. Okay? The fact being that if we're considering technology that's potentially going to decrease ambient light levels on the Earth, we have to consider the implications of what that could mean, as rather than undoing what we're doing, flip-flopping climate back into a situation where we could wind up making a bigger mess of things than we had initially.
It brings up a very interesting point that I more or less omitted in the intro interest of brevity, let me first sound like a Reagan Republican and say, it's not generally accepted in the scientific community, but may well be true. So, of course, we can ignore it until it bites us in the ass. But there is lots of mounting evidence that the Earth's climate varies a real whole lot, and the reason we have civilization now is it happened to be very nice for a while, and maybe it's not going to be very nice for very much longer. So environmental remediation could very quickly end up being climate control. There's a lot of argument, which is pretty respectable, may turn out to be correct, that what's been happening with all this CO2, the reason you don't see a horrendous rise in temperature is it simply offset the horrendous plunge in temperature that should have been going on for the last 50 years. And that if we stopped burning coal, we would now go into an ice age. Not know. Probably a really good thing to know in the fairly near future, because it has very profound implications for our own personal lives. Let's do 3 more questions and then on to the next talk. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, just a kind of an intuitive or gut feeling is I'm kind of hesitant about deploying anything in space that I might have trouble undeploying later. So, going out to scoop up a whole bunch of dust kind of makes me nervous.
There are kind of irreversible, and that's one of them. The solar sails have the advantage that you can basically tell them to go somewhere else. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was listening. My name's Darren Swanick. I'm from New Jersey. I've been listening to the argument even before I came out to the West Coast for the conference. I was wondering to myself, why aren't the environmentalists or a few of the environmentalist groups as well as the space community working together for something? As I'm sitting here and you talk about how some of them are almost anti-knowledge, it makes me think that a number of people who aren't familiar with the space program may be equally afraid of technology just because they don't understand it. I've already run into people who, as far as they knew, we've already landed man on the moon. Man on Mars, excuse me. And they didn't know where the moon was. They kind of got lost somewhere. These were adults. The students were just slightly better. But, is anyone right now working towards combining the 2 groups together to at least start addressing something, possibly even start attempting to educate people and not make them so afraid?
Pretty much everyone seems to be trying in their own way. It's very popular in the space movement now to talk about that. I suppose it's popular in the pro-life movement to talk about why all these anti-life people don't see things their way and how they can work together with them. Popular in the pro-choice movement. And to a certain extent, they're all right, and everyone here is also right that there certainly should be some commonality of view, because there is some correctness in our arguments. Certainly some people in the environmental movement will see that. But perhaps by each of us working for this in our own way, we're doing much more the right thing than trying to be centralized and only trying one approach. As some of the people here will happen to be using a good approach and happen to have heard a lot of them, and the rest of us can simply imitate their approach. It's a very hot topic right now. There's no central move. There's more central authorities like NSS headquarters tend to publish vague statements on this periodically because everyone's trying it, so it's obviously a very important part of the movement. But whether or not there is a movement to do this is a question in a lot of ways. Yes, sir.
My name is Thomas Aaron. I have to be local representative out there. I'd like to just comment on the interglacial period, I suppose that we're in right now. I read a lot of different magazines, like Scientific American, etc. Supposedly, the Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, and they don't really know the condition of the atmosphere. They, sometimes they maybe it's like Venus and just tiny times what it is here, etc. It's like from ice core samples, they say, well, back in the age of the dinosaurs, say 65 million years ago, the Earth's atmosphere was 30% oxygen, where it's 20% now. And the Earth's, or the sun's brilliance has increased 25% since, 4.5 billion years ago. So we we have all this coal and oil that was supposedly laid down at a period of time. So where did all the carbon dioxide come from to form all of this? And if there was a lot of it in the atmosphere, then how come the thing didn't burn up back then? I mean, there seems to be a lot of things that the Earth has gone through, and we seem to kind of think, well, right now for the past 20 years, it's been this condition, and I mean, like if you look in the records, like the Sahara Desert was a grassland 3,000 years ago. Everybody seems to think everything's supposed to stay the same.
Yeah, it would seem like the only constant is change. There does turn out to be really enormous amounts of CO2 in limestone, and the Earth has about as much CO2 as Venus. It turns out it just has more water. It seems to have gotten trapped in the limestone. So, in the interest of time, if you will excuse me, is it correct to say that you're trying to point out that really the only constant is change? The change is not well understood. We don't have much idea of what the Earth has been like over almost all its history, and perhaps we should be prepared to deal with it changing rapidly in the future.
Yeah, well, it's just kind of like the forest issue. You have new growth, mature forests, and you have old growth. Now, the old growth ones, they produce an excess of CO2, where mature ones are kind of normal, or, don't gain, don't lose. And new growth absorb, on the whole. So you have a deal of, well, we need to cut down the mature ones and the old growth ones and have nothing but new growth ones if we're going to lower the CO2 level. But the thing is, you can't just burn the stuff. You have to put, do something with it, whether it's making it into houses or go out and take a valley and fill it up with it and make a new coal field for 5 million years from now or something. Instead of saying, well, we can't touch these. I mean, it's like the Indians. The Indians didn't have any concept of wilderness. I mean, it was home, food, and we seem to have kind of made this thing of some artificial thing.
Yeah. So, if people who got cut off now will pardon me and hold their questions for later, I hope that they come up appropriately then.